George, how are we?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No, really, really privileged to have you here. And there's lots of things that I'm thoroughly excited and intrigued to discuss with you. Starting off with a question that I reflect on quite a lot and have a lot of conversations about, and that is, what are men missing in the modern world?
I think men are missing the same flexibility and freedoms as a lot of women have. I was talking to my girlfriend about this only about an hour ago. When I was growing up, and even still now, I feel like men don't actually have a lot of the flexibility that women have. I think masculinity is far more rigid in terms of how we are able to express ourselves, in terms of what we can and can't wear, like music we can and can't like, or films, like even like cocktails you can't order because they're pink. I don't care. I'll order whatever cocktail I want. But I often feel like everyone talks about this word oppressed. Personally, I don't think anyone is oppressed in this country today. But when I think of oppression, I think about how few men can express themselves in the full sort of gamut of their emotional sort of reality, or even like what they wear. Like a lot of men, you're wearing like dark blue, grey or black or white, and that's really it. But I look at the women's section, the clothing and stuff like that, and it's just like floral patterns and bright sort of neon colours and stuff like that. And I'm always like, I feel like generally what men are missing is the ability to express themselves as broadly and as unapologetically as women. And I'm honestly quite jealous about how free a lot of women are to express themselves in that way and to wear those things and like that music and order that cocktail. So, yeah.
It's interesting that both things that you've said there could irritate either side of the coin. There'll be men that feel that everything you've just said doesn't fit with their worldview and their definition of masculinity, and there'll be women that might take offence at the fact that I've even asked the question and implied that men are missing something in the modern world. And I think it's important to preface the conversation from here with what would you say to people that feel an emotional spike with what you've just said? Because you deal with it online all the time. It's how do we preface this so people understand that this is a dialogue, it's a discussion, and without things like this, we cannot move forwards?
I understand this question. Often when we talk about men and boys advocacy, it always has to come with some sort of disclaimer or like small print sort of apology almost. It's a sense of shame around it, unfortunately, where you can't say things about like male victims of abuse or homeless men or male victims of violence sexually without also acknowledging the other side of the coin. I understand why I'm asked to do that all the time, but I also try not to, because I find if it's asked of me, it feels disingenuous. And also I don't necessarily feel like we need to frame men and boys advocacy in that way. Like men and boys can have this conversation in their own right for themselves, and there's no apology needed for that. But since you have asked me, there is no limit to how much compassion we can have. Like we can be compassionate towards anyone and everyone. Like just because I care for men and boys doesn't mean I don't care equally as much for women and girls. And often not only is helping men and boys important for men and boys themselves, but it has a secondary benefit of it. It helps them be better people, which we all benefit from. And it also helps solve issues that impact people far wider than men and boys. So like often if you look at violent men, which is constantly in the news, violence against women, for example, often those violent men are victims themselves who have sort of been forgotten about or left behind. They're suffering of trauma or addiction or some sort of bullying in childhood. And if we can't solve those problems, those men will become who they are today, and we all pay the price of that. We all pay the price of men's criminality. And if we can solve those problems before they become criminal, they benefit everyone. But like I said, I really struggle to make that. I always don't understand why we have to do that. I've never seen these sort of special pleas made in any other area of advocacy. And I try not to spend too much time doing it, because like right now, it sounds like we're just wasting time. And I don't think it needs to be said. Like I don't need to prove myself. I don't think you need to prove yourself. And we just need to stop apologizing, I think, for caring about the other half of the world's population.
The reason I ask is because of exactly what you highlighted, which is the capacity that people have to slip into this demand for either or, rather than, as you said, compassion knows no bounds. It can be spread equally. And the more that we develop our literacy for compassion and emotions, the more widespread that can be for the challenges that we all face. And the reason I thought that I would bring it up, not in an apologetic sense, but more as a commentary on, I mean, if you go on your Instagram, you can see people will see a certain word and just go down a certain direction. And I just think that makes no sense in the modern world, where we are trying to solve problems that have nuance. And I think where the either-orism has got a little bit out of control is the man versus bear discussion that's ongoing. And I know that you've spoken about it online, so I'm keen to get your take on why you think it's been conceptualized and how we should consider it.
You are absolutely right. It's not an either or situation, it's a both and. And that's the problem with so many, it's men and boys advocacy is unique in a second way. The second way is that we have the issues themselves, let's say like boys in school, boys being behind in education at every single level in the West. That's the problem. But then there's a second level to that problem where there's a sort of a thin layer of like very angry people who are very reluctant to have that conversation and will stop others from addressing that problem. And those are the people you're talking about, the people throwing the stones and causing a nuisance and rocking about. A lot of people are quite afraid of. A lot of people are afraid to share my content because of those people. And the price people often pay for talking about these things. I don't know why it has to be so divisive. I don't see why it has to be some sort of gender war. I don't know why we can't talk about both. But I think a lot of it's because people identify very strongly with this idea of a very one-way nature to sexism. People think only women can experience sexism, women and girls, but of course men and boys can experience it too. And people have become enamored of this very one-dimensional view of sexism and men and boys and masculinity. And they've dug their heels in so much, they've made it sort of part of who they are. It's very much embedded into their entire identity, their online world, their community, their friends, their work. And they can't seem to change. They can't, like, it's a bit like being attached to a football team. Like, it doesn't matter what happens, you'll always be a fan of that football team. And people will follow that same philosophy of politics where they're just entrenched, and it's not about finding truth, it's just about beating the other side at any cost. So that's where I feel like we've become. And I try not to like brand my work with that sort of discourse. I really didn't enjoy the man versus bear meme. I've tried for so long not to talk about it. And I had to eventually. It just got so out of hand. And then I remember going to national news. I went to a national radio station, the BBC, just 2 weeks ago to talk about it. And I was just like, why are we talking about this? I spent last 5 minutes listening to all these bare facts, and no one's actually talked about violent crime, what the risk factors are of violent crime, or who's at risk, and how do we mitigate these things. No one ever heard that discussed whatsoever. I heard a bunch of great stuff about bears. And I said that. I was like, the best way to make women feel safe is not to compare men to bears, and to spend this time talking about what violence is and how it's systemic and how it's reciprocal and generational, and talk about how do we stop it. And then the DJ at the time was like, well, you've not seen our agenda, our schedule. We're going to get round to it. We never got round to it. Just for the record, we never got round to it. We didn't talk about anything useful. We just talked about bears. And that for me is like a microcosm of the entire bear debate, where it's just endless arguing. And it's very difficult for me because I'm just constantly putting out fires.
Yeah. That was my take on it as well. I admit I sort of saw it crop up a few weeks ago. Thought, oh, here we go, and it kind of lingered for a while. That sort of thing that I thought would die out quickly stayed around for a little bit, and then I saw you comment on it, and I thought, okay, my immediate thought was, oh, he's been dragged in, but not by a bear, thankfully, because it's just again for me that is the peak of this hypothetical either or what if that doesn't allow for positive, compassionate, driven conversation to occur, which I think is what we need to be able to make progress in this space for the sake of all. Because obviously the reason that I'm so passionate about this topic is because I am the survivor of a suicide attempt. And what's terrifying to me still is that the biggest threat to us as men before the age of 25 is ourself. And that as a statement seems...
Even later, up to 50.
Saying that sentence seems crazy. Yeah, it's constantly changing, isn't it? I think in the stats are trickling back, and we actually still use outdated stats. I think the 83 men die by suicide every week in the UK is the 2019 Samaritans report, and we've come a long way since then in terms of time, and sadly in terms of statistics. So I know that you've got some pretty clear. You've got a fantastic understanding of the science and the research, and we'll come on to Susie Bennett's qualitative study. But I think I'm just keen to get your understanding of what what are the significant contributing factors to why suicide is such a prevalent problem for men?
I'm glad you brought up Susie Bennett. It makes me laugh because every podcast I do, her name's brought up, and I'm so proud it is. But suicide. I'll do her. I'll say what she would say, and it's like no suicide is ever the same. Every suicide is unique to every single man. And the brutal truth of suicide is that we don't really know why men do it. Like, you talk to bereaved families and they'll have no idea why their father or son or brother ended their life by suicide. And that's why it's so tragic. So I want to start by saying there is no one single answer. There's only a multiplicity of answers that intersect together. But overall, I would say suicide is, for men especially, is too much placed within the man's head. Like, we see it as an internalized problem, some sort of medical issue, some sort of chemical imbalance to be medicated away, or some sort of mental health problem to be talked about. And although those things can be useful for some men, overall, research is showing us that men who are suicidal don't consider themselves as having a mental health problem. They have a problem that's out there, external, structural, and they can't really do anything about it. It can't be medicated away. It can't be spoken about. It will be things like debt or joblessness or experiences of abuse or experiences of childhood trauma or bullying in school. It will be so many different, a lot of it, for example, is tied to child custody. I've heard data saying that 1 in 5 suicides in the UK of men is linked to relationship breakdown and child custody battles. And there is just a huge cohort of men fighting for their children, so fathers, and fighting a losing battle against a sexist family court system. And a lot of them turn to suicide. They're not mentally unwell. They've just lost their child. And in fact, they're responding in a way that actually makes a lot of sense. So I'd say in general, we need to stop seeing suicide as an irrational decision based on some sort of mental health problem, and start to understand suicide as a rational, solution-based outcome for many men who are trying to solve a problem of which they can't control, and they've got no choices left. So it's very much out there, and it highlights a very important generalized difference between how we look at women and men's issues. For men's issues, we say, for women's issues, for example, we say the problem's out there in society, we need to change society. For men's issues, we only ever say he needs to change himself. And until we start seeing men in the same way as women, the victim of issues that they are not fully in control of, structural sexism, then I don't know what we can really do for male suicide. A lot of it is revolving around this idea of like talking more, which I appreciate and agree with, and I encourage. I'm going to one of his groups today, actually. But I don't think that's a complete solution at all. I feel like the solution happens next, where those groups and those charities then have to talk themselves about the things that men are telling them. Like, for example, 11% of men who are being abused in the UK will attempt suicide. That is a massive problem when you consider 3 million male victims of abuse. If one of those men goes to a talk group and tells the people there, like, I'm being abused, there's nowhere for me to go, there are no shelters, I call up the abuse helpline, they think I'm a predator, no one believes me, the police hang up the phone. If that charity, listening to that man, doesn't then go on to advocate for greater support for male victims of abuse, more shelters, more funding, a fundamental change in the way in which police handle abuse against men, then that charity is not doing enough, in my opinion. Like, it's not good enough to just give men a place to speak. We need to give men a place to speak and for us to listen, and hopefully society to change. So we're doing good work within male suicide, but nowhere near enough. And it's about time we moved along. And I don't know, got stuck in a bit more with the political advocacy side.
There's a huge amount of value in talking, from my perspective anyway. And I agree entirely. It's a starting point. It's not the solution. And I've always been, be a man of more words was the campaign that I used for my first Movember campaign. And that's tattooed on me because it meant so much to me at the time. But I quickly learned, actually, all that being a man of more words gave for me was the understanding in and of myself to try and unpack the more practical things that, like you were saying, were external in my life that I could better understand. And what I found really amazing about that process was it actually made it simpler for me in the future, whereby I'm much more in control of how I feel about things, how I respond to things, by being aware and having gained emotional literacy through understanding the things that I had to unpack in the first place. And I only got there through talking. So I think what the narrative needs to do a bit more of is equip men with the understanding of how to begin that process and then what action follows next. And I think that's the key that's missing. It's the action, isn't it? And I know that you've been outspoken about charities maybe falling a bit short of that piece. So what do you think charities are doing wrong when it comes to supporting men?
They're not speaking. They're not speaking themselves. Like, charities are just asking men to talk, and men are talking. Like, the vast majority of men who die by suicide do actually talk and have actually sought help, but the help they got was not adequate and it failed them, and they still died by suicide. And by that I mean 91% of middle-aged men who died by suicide in the UK that was studied did actually seek help. So this meme of like men can talk as some sort of final solution, like some sort of silver bullet to male suicide, is just not good enough. So I would say charities need to talk themselves. They're the ones who need to talk and actually do something about the problems that men are telling them about. Like, it's just not enough. Like, you are right. Talking is excellent. Like, Susie and I have described male suicide a bit like a pot of water on a stove, and it's bubbling up and it's about to pop off and it's like overflowing on the saucepan. That man talking is the equivalent of taking the lid off that saucepan. Like, you're taking the lid off, you're allowing it to breathe, you're allowing it to settle down. Eventually, the lid has to go on. And even if that is just like one hour a week at one of these groups, that's excellent. But you need to turn the hob off. That's the problem. The problem is the hob is still on. And taking the lid off does help. It helps deal with the problem itself, but I don't know if it solves the problem. And we need to work out what is the thing that's creating that heat. Is it a man in debt? Is it a man losing his job? Is it a man losing his child? Is it some sort of relationship breakdown or some sort of experience of abuse? Like, don't just keep telling them to talk if we're not listening to what they've got to say. And if, like, as well, we need to let men speak about what they want to speak about. So often men do talk and we don't like what they've got to say, and we tell them to shut up. So then we've got like these two coexisting strands where one side's telling men to talk and the other's telling men to shut up. And overall, we can all do better, and we have to do better, and recognize male suicide is a massive societal epidemic problem that we all need to help solve, and not just throw it at the feet of men as if they're the ones that caused it and therefore they're the ones that can solve it.
And we need to tackle it from the ground upwards rather than from the ceiling downwards, is the way that I've always viewed it. And I think that especially people in discussions day to day, don't get me wrong, I'm not in any way undermining those that are supportive and can help people when in crisis or having a challenge. But the human response when a discussion on mental well-being, depression, suicidal thoughts comes up is to try and understand and then work backwards from that point, when in reality the person's probably just looking for support first and foremost to then piece things together to move forwards with. And what I can't wrap my head around, with a rational brain now, the world in which I existed where I was irrationally spiraling to the point of a suicide attempt is not a world I can conceive of. Even I myself cannot understand and rationalize that version of me, which just goes to show how little we can actually potentially understand about, as you said, every individual has a different set of circumstances, yet we try to understand it as a general point, which is the ceiling downwards rather than the ground upwards. And I think, as you said, it's the source that we need to tackle more. And there's a lot of sources that are being grossly underserved in all over the world, but especially here in the UK. And I know that you've got lots of information as to what that is, but before we dive into those points, what were the main takeaways from Susie's study? Because it was published was January 2023 it came out, so it's fairly recent, and it's the most in-depth qualitative study analysis on the topic that's come out in recent years, isn't it?
It is. I mean, Susie, the thing that, the most obvious thing that came out of the study is it's 45 pages long, and the citations go on and on and on. It's an absolutely massive study, very unusual for a journal such as the Psychological Bulletin, which is one of the most prestigious journals of its kind, to publish such a massive study, let alone give it away for free. So the fact that it's this big, and that's only one strand of male suicide research, shows how complicated it is. And Susie herself would say, I don't have all the answers. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what causes male suicide. I've got to study, it's absolutely enormous, but that's still just scratching the surface. One of the things Susie talks about from her research overall is that male loneliness and isolation, probably the biggest, most important factor related to male suicide, and the importance of men having spaces to talk to other men and build relationships and learn to express themselves and feel less lonely. Like, male loneliness is a massive problem. I see it a lot because I'm not on the research side, I'm on the sort of the communication side. And whenever anyone talks about lonely men, there's this, like I said, this backlash of these people that just hate the idea of men spending time with each other, hate the idea of male spaces. The idea of men bonding is just sickening to them. And it's frustrating how we have this problem of male suicide. One of the solutions to male suicide is men spending more time together and building friendships with one another. But yet that thing, which could be the antidote to so many, is seen as abhorrent and hateful and to be just discouraged. Like we saw like even like things like Boy Scouts now, which is last week, in fact, has now finally renamed itself from Boy Scouts to Scouting America because it accepts girls. And like, that's a real shame, I'm afraid, I think. And like, I understand that girls want to learn how to like whittle and build fires and stuff. And I would want to do that too. And that's why Girl Scouts has changed, and Girl Scouts doesn't allow boys, but Boy Scouts has sort of become like a generic place for everyone. And it's no longer a place for boys to bond in the same way that there are many, many, many men's groups that have just closed down. Some are opening up, some are closing down. And I feel like male loneliness is a big problem. To go back to the study, a different study that Susie did, Susie's obviously a woman, for the record, and she doesn't like to speak on behalf of men because she's a woman. So her research is unique in the sense that she asks suicidal men and bereaved families and clinical experts all around the world, what do you think we need to do next? So Susie did basically create an agenda by asking hundreds of men who had attempted suicide and bereaved families and a dozen or so international experts, what are the priorities for male suicide research in the next 10 years? And 98% of them said male loneliness. It was the number one thing people want to know more about. So the thing that comes out of Susie's research, aside from its length and depth, is the importance of men spending time with other men, and how damaging loneliness can be to men, and how isolated so many men feel.
And what's horrifying about the reality of that is that is what the study has found. And recently we saw an example of, I can't remember where the study came from, but it was essentially highlighting that men should be spending more time together. 2 nights a week is optimal for men to be the best versions of themselves. Yeah. I think it was Puberty that posted about it. And it just immediately was flooded with selfish, hiding from their wives, hiding from their kids. Oh, wouldn't that be nice? Oh, I wish I could do this. All of these immediately negative things. Yeah, exactly. And that just goes to show exactly what you said, which is that we can be outspoken about certain things, but they're not received in the way that they need to be to have an impact. Yeah. And the writing is on the wall with that study, yet it's not accepted by society yet. So,
like I said, like there's the issues themselves. Well, there's the issues themselves, like I said, and in front of those are like a thin band of ogres who swing their club at anyone that dares approach those issues and tries to solve those issues. And all those ogres are in that comment section, whining and whinging and making it about themselves and demanding 7 nights off for women. Why are men not with their children? Why? I can't believe this. Boo-hoo, poor men. They're the problem too. The problem is not just male loneliness. The second problem is that secondary tier of arseholes, ogres, that are just refusing to let anyone talk about it. Like Warren Farrell, for example, probably the world's leading advocate for men. He went to speak at Toronto University, and there were people literally outside, like barring people from entry, shouting at people, pulling fire alarms, banging pots. And they're the problem too. It's not just the things that Warren's talking about. It's the fact that he can't talk about them without being heckled and harassed and assaulted by the ogres. And that's why it's so difficult, because there's a 2-tier problem of men and boys advocacy that is sort of unique. And we need to deal with both parts. And those comment sections were... The comment sections of those posts told me a lot more than the study itself. The study itself was sort of flawed, and it was done by Robin Dunbar. Yes. But the real study was people's reaction to the idea of men spending time together, and how sickened so many people were, and how open they were to saying how sickened it was. Obviously gross, totally gross, and yeah.
In terms of neuroscience as well, we can empirically prove, can't we, that men basically get a huge amount of value in oxytocin from solving problems together. It's a very tribal thing, but it's why a game of darts over a pint can be such a rewarding thing, because there's a metric, there's a social lubricant, there's a way to break down some of the societal stigmas. There's that detachment from masculinity because you're in an open forum that feels masculine, which means you can actually maybe be yourself, like you were saying at the start. And it's why things like that are so rewarding for men, and we don't realize how valuable they are until we stop doing them. Golf is a great one for me. I get asked to play golf with my friend. I don't get asked all that often anymore because I've said I can't manage so many times. But the amount of value I get from playing a round of golf with my friends on a Sunday, just spending 4 hours outdoors walking without any distraction other than bad and frustrating golf, of course, is the most rewarding and valuable time that I can spend working on myself, because it just allows me to think a little bit more clearly. And what I take away from that just feeds my emotional understanding of myself, which makes me better for others, it makes me better for myself, and it makes me a more reliable human being. And I think that's what's being missed with this. It's me time, isn't it? It's men need me time to be able to develop emotional literacy and to understand themselves and work together, because we haven't taught emotional literacy in men as well as we have with women. And that's probably where a lot of this problem is coming from.
Absolutely. I mean, that's called alexithymia, if you want to put a word to it, the ability to describe emotions through words. And men have higher levels of alexithymia than women, meaning that they struggle more to communicate their feelings. But absolutely right. What you're talking about in terms of going to golf is that's what's known as a new concept called shoulder-to-shoulder time. So people talk about face-to-face time, which is a bit like what we're doing now. And that's sort of captured within the traditional sort of structure of therapy, where you go into a room, you sit down, usually with a woman, and you have face-to-face time. But people are saying that isn't as effective for men, because men prefer shoulder-to-shoulder time or side-by-side time, which is exactly as you described. Men like to be more active. They like to be outside, walking around, moving about with friends, perhaps in groups. And it seems to be a more effective way of men opening up. Like, men are opening up, but they may not want to open up in like a clinical space if some random middle-aged woman who doesn't really understand what he's going through, but he does want to open up with his mates whilst practicing his golf swing. And that, to me, really demonstrates how a lot of our psychological work, psychological interventions and suicide interventions are often based around women's needs, because the psychological industry is dominated by women. And it's naturally and not intentionally, it's come up with ideas and approaches that are perhaps more suitable to women, less so for men. And I guess that also proves why so many men don't go to therapy. And so many men do talk in the way I described, but it doesn't do anything for them because they still die by suicide. So you're certainly not alone in wanting more shoulder-to-shoulder time. And you highlighted beautifully why it's so important for men to have that. And it also, a second thing that really brings up for me is that everyone in the space, the men and boys advocacy spaces, are constantly asking for money. We need funding. We need a minister for men. We need a whatever department for men and boys. We need to be taken more seriously. And that is true. And we do need these things, but not all the time. Like some interventions we can do right now. There's nothing stopping you or me or anyone listening to this calling their friend after this podcast, inviting their mates for a round of golf or something, or darts. And that doesn't require funding. That doesn't require any sort of government sort of intervention whatsoever. And and I'm quoting Susie again, we all have the ability to heal each other. We all have the ability to do that for free right now. And it helps us too. Like, I hate golf, so it won't be golf for me, but I do like spending time with the lads. And so hopefully after this podcast, at least one person will call up their friend and ask them for a round of golf. And I feel like you'll be better off for it. Like, who knows what you could have saved that person from going through. So absolutely.
That's the key. That's the key, isn't it? And just to underline, I went on a golf course, also hate golf, but I love the idea of being good at golf, which keeps drawing me back. But I think the thing that runs through all of this is the more shoulder-to-shoulder time that we facilitate as a collective, the more skills we are equipping ourselves with to allow that to benefit others downstream. And whenever I speak to schools, I'll always talk about the opportunity that we have to be somebody that can be relied upon if somebody is ever in a time of crisis or somebody is ever looking for some moral support. And that is an opportunity that a lot of us squander. I squandered it for many years until I was almost dead, a result of my own perception of masculinity and definition of success. I would have laughed in your face and called you a pussy, probably, if you'd even told me that mental health was a real thing. I fell into this masculinity trap, this traditional notion of linear success trap that just gave me a worldview that wasn't right for me. And I think that's what's at the core of all this, and we've kind of touched on already, but I'm keen to know, you probably won't be able to give an answer, but for you personally, how do you define masculinity? Can it be defined? What does it mean to you?
Oh God, it's so difficult. I mean, it's both subjective and not subjective. Like I struggle to sort of dance between the sort of centrist view, because I do feel like there are things that are masculine, and I don't think it's entirely socially constructed, and I don't think it's toxic. But it's very difficult to describe through words. Like, you can go through an entire dictionary looking for a word to describe masculinity, and you probably won't find a single one. I like to sort of, it's a bit of a get out free card, but I like to think of masculinity as something that can't even be described through language. I think it's part of our brain that is so ancient, so spiritual perhaps, that words doesn't make sense in the world of words. It doesn't like, it's like, I also love space. People don't understand what happened before the Big Bang. And that question doesn't make sense either. It's like going to the North Pole and asking what's north of the North Pole. There isn't nothing north. Like, how do you describe like any emotions? How do you describe shame? How do you describe the color green, for example? Like, I know this is sounding like a cop out, but I genuinely don't think masculinity makes sense in the language of the world. I think the part of our brain that masculinity comes from is so old that language doesn't even exist. It's like a gut feeling, for example.
I think that's the key for me. That's how my understanding is developed. It's that gut feeling. I believe that the mark of being, even saying a man is a stretch, but I think to be masculine in the modern world is to hold yourself accountable to that gut feeling, because that's who you truly are. And it really feeds back to what you were saying. If you want to, it's as simple as if you want to order the Cosmopolitan in the tall, skinny glass, then that's what you should do. But if you don't hold yourself accountable to what your gut is telling you to do, to be who you believe you are, or you're repressing the things that you know are good for you and that you want to enact in the world, you're being dishonest to yourself, and you're not actually capitalizing on the individuality and the uniqueness that we are all very fortunate to have, that comes from that sort of cosmic, incomprehensible, how are we here and why am I the way that I am question. But we get signals, don't we? And I think the only way you can almost fall short of that, not in a critical sense, because everybody's obviously got different approaches to things, but I feel that being authentic to who you truly believe you are is the biggest mark of success in the modern world, because there's a lot of stimuli telling you what you should be. So if you can lean into your gut, I think it's a powerful thing to do.
Well, your answers are far more profound than mine was. So now you made me look even worse. You clearly thought about it for longer than I have. But it's difficult.
I'll admit, you got my brain going there. So your get out of jail free card it's kind of put me. Yeah, it's put me into a very cushy Wolf of Wall Street style paddle court jail there in my head. That's kind of how I landed.
Yeah, I mean, the real questions are like, where does it come from? If masculinity is going to be defined as male typical behavior, then the next question would be, well, where does that come from? Is it sort of wired into our brains, or is it out there in society, projected onto us? Is it a combination of both? Is it something else? I mean, obviously, I'm always in the middle, so I'd say both. But I mean, it's just a massive rabbit hole. The masculinity question is so just endless. It's endless.
I'd like to think that everybody listening has something jump to mind. I think that's what I hope for, is that everybody thinks of it in a different way than Andrew Tate presents it. I guess it's kind of my summary. Is the archetype of masculinity that TikTok now presents. I'd like people to think a little bit more critically than that. So if this podcast does that, then that'll be a huge success in my mind.
I mean, Andrew Tate is the antithesis of masculinity. He's just an extremely fragile man who exploits a very cartoonish archetype of masculinity and manliness, and is anything but an alpha male. Like alpha males, especially in like nature, like the first work on alpha males came not from wolves but from chimpanzees. And the alpha males in chimpanzee groups are extremely empathetic and emotional, feeling. They love playing with children. They love to build relationships with the women. They're basically like coalition builders in chief. They're not angry, like Bugatti driving idiots yelling at people. They're thoughtful. They're kind. They're stressed out. Like the alpha male in chimpanzees is the most stressed chimp of them all, and the most empathetic. And they are big and strong and heroic and courageous, but they're also very emotional, empathetic, and caring. And Andrew Tate is really a very poor representation of that, and certainly not an alpha. And that just makes me cringe, the whole discussion about alpha males. And he's a dreadful role model as well.
It's a corner of the internet that I often scoff at. It'll occasionally sneak its way into something that I see, and it's just oh dear, here we go again, move on. But I think the question is where did we lose? Societal understanding of masculinity has become quite binary. I think it's fair to say. Whether that's just my bias because I felt like I fell into a bit of a trap with it, I don't know. But I feel like there are some common traits that we all, if there's buzzwords we ask for, people will have certain things coming to their head, which are all quite similar. And I think the Industrial Revolution's been referenced as one of the turning points for the expression of emotions in men, hasn't it? Because I find it, going back to the TikTok scrolling side of things, those that are referencing Stoic quotes, those that are idolizing ancient Greece, often forget that ancient Greeks were celebrated for crying in many different ways. And the Odyssey has the whole army. Yeah. It's well documented there, and how much that is fact, how much that is fiction, how much it is myth, but it is a product of the time that is referenced often.
Like Japan, same deal. Like it was seen as a hallmark of masculinity within samurais. To cry was seen as like the ultimate show of masculinity. And I've got a quote here from one of your posts actually on that. The tale of Heike. Of all who heard, friend or foe, not one but wept until his sleeves were drenched, on how to be an ideal samurai. That's like the Bible of how to be a samurai as well. That's like and you see it everywhere. You see it throughout history, like stories of like Lancelot, I think, crying to his wife, and obviously Iliad and samurais, and it was seen as a very normal thing for men to do, encouraged in fact. And you are right in terms of that sort of changed during the Industrial Revolution, where tears were seen as a sort of a barrier for a man being productive. Like you can't have a man being emotional whilst he's working in the factory, he's got to work. And it was that sort of change during the Industrial Revolution. And that's how we got to where we are now, where tears are seen. I know it's changing. We are encouraging men to be more expressive, but we shamed men a lot more and discouraged crying as a result of the Industrial Revolution and stuff like that. But it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's right through history. It's seen as a hallmark of masculinity, as it should be.
There's something that you said, which really resonated with me on this topic, that I thought was a really, really good development to the conversation. So I'm just going to quote yourself back to you first of all.
Thank you.
Don't just tell men to talk or cry. Have the patience and willingness to teach them how. So how do we teach men emotional literacy?
This is alexithymia, like I said, which is Greek. I think it's Greek, and it means without words for emotions. And it's been documented as being higher in men. So you have male alexithymia. First of all, I think we need to recognize where it comes from, like what causes it. And it's not biological. In fact, boys have actually been found to have be more expressive, both visually and vocally, than girls at a young age. So clearly something changed in the way we socialize as boys from that point. And it comes from parents, it comes from sports coaches, teachers, babysitters, friends. Like these are the ones that are molding boys into what they want them to do or not do. So I feel like the first step to teaching men to express themselves is for us as a society to acknowledge where those restraints came from. Like I said, society, not from men themselves, or partly from men, but not just from men. And then secondly, to treat it like an actual language itself. Like I tried to learn French and I wasn't particularly good at it. It took me years to string a sentence together, and that's okay. It's the same for emotional literacy. It takes time. You can't just be like, men can talk and then it's like, I'll get around to it, would you? It's like, it takes time. Like he's spent his whole life marinated in this idea of men can't talk, men shouldn't do that. It takes a long time to unpack all that conditioning and then to learn the words of emotional eloquence themselves. So address where the problem comes from, understand it takes time, treat it like a real language, and most of all, have patience and actually listen to them and help them. Like I said, it took me a long time to learn to speak French, even at a very small level. And it required a lot of people to help me. So remind yourself that emotional eloquence is a language in its own right. Men have got a lifetime of conditioning they need to unpack that has stopped them from learning those things. And it wasn't necessarily men on their own that made it this way. They've been conditioned by everyone. Everyone's conditioned, including mothers. So I feel like overall just widening that conversation and understanding it in a bit more detail. And of course, patience.
How did it develop for you as an individual? Do you always feel that you've been emotionally literate, or is there a turning point that you can reference where you felt like...
Dreadful. No, I mean, I like... I love writing. I love expressing I love expressing myself through words, but not necessarily my emotions. I don't always like to talk about my emotions. Perhaps I should. But as much as I like reading and writing, I often don't write about how I'm feeling. And I do think I have a good understanding of my feelings, and I can express myself quite well emotionally in private. I just think it comes through time. It just comes through time and practice, and listening to women, of course. Women are just the innovators and pioneers of language. Like, their grasp of language is just so much further ahead than men's in general, that we need to learn from them. And I think a lot of women have learned from men, and there's nothing wrong with men learning from women. So in terms of my emotional literacy, I have a lot of women to thank for that as well. A lot of women have been patient with me, and it just takes time. But it wasn't something I had naturally, and it wasn't something my parents bestowed onto me either. It just came at the cost of a lot of work, not just by myself, but by a lot of people in my life.
And it's not an on or off switch, is it? It's always evolving. It's something that we need to never get complacent with. I've found that I've got a little bit complacent since recovering and understanding myself a lot better. I've almost lost grasp of a few things that I know are positive and act as anchors for my own emotional literacy internally before they even need to be externalized first and foremost. And I've had to call myself out, and actually Erin, my wife, calls me out on it now. She's got a phenomenal eye for knowing what's going on in my head before I even see it these days. But that's trained. It'd be silly to say that that's just something she picked up through me saying, this is how I feel. Therefore I can spot this in you. It's much more complex than that. And yeah, I think opening your mind to doing the work is the first step. And that's where talking becomes a real catalyst. But action, repetition, shoulder to shoulder time, and trying to unpack or tackle some of the challenges that are the source of men's loneliness and problems is, I guess, what sort of comes next. So I think it's probably worth diving into. We'll dive into some of the sources of those problems, but I feel like you've got something to add.
I was going to say, it's not. I always try not to limit the responsibility to men, though. Like, there's a lot of women that are just dreadful listeners to men. A lot of women, girlfriends, partners, wives, are awful. I get so many men message me, and they're like, I tried to speak to my wife about a problem I have, or maybe something that she's done, and she got angry at me, and then he had to apologize to her for being honest. And like, a lot of things men say or want to speak about are not easy to listen to. They might make you prickle, or might make you want to like say something back, or stop listening, or walk out the room. And that it's important for people listening to men not to indulge in that behavior. As difficult as it is, sometimes it's hard to listen to what men have got to say, especially if what they've got to say is something about you that is they don't like. I mean, I've definitely had women I've dated, and they've done something to upset me, and I've finally built up the courage to tell them, and then they get upset, having upset me, and then like I said, I apologize to them. And a lot of men have had very poor experiences of being listened to, and even worse than that, like women that will listen to them and like store away what they said and then keep it on file, and in like an argument later in life, they'll use the thing the man said as a sort of way of getting back at them. So it's not just down to men learning to talk, but more us learning to listen more broadly, and to refrain from sort of knee-jerk responses in the way I described.
And that scenario, I guess, is lower level, but it could be one of the contributing factors that leads to a lot of things that we've discussed. It's a negative relationship, or the Absolutely. Potential to become a abusive relationship, and all of these things that are a little bit more difficult to discuss, that are often really well discussed in women's spaces, are the contributing factors that I know you advocate for a lot more aggressively than some of the major charity outlets, media outlets will do when it comes to this. So from your perspective, what are the most underserved contributing factors to male loneliness that we are not ignoring statistically, that we are not serving through the statistics?
I think it's male loneliness I feel like there's so many different things going on there, but overall I feel like there was just, like I said, like a lot of shame around male spaces. It's like unfairly vilified a lot of the time, seen as like the home of the patriarchy or some toxic masculinity hotbed. And it really isn't. It's really not that exciting. Like the time I spend with men, we don't talk about any of that. We just talk about stupid things. And I feel like a better understanding of good faith understanding of male spaces, and then also an understanding of the benefit they offer to men. Surely the sort of the cornerstone of any sort of change. But loneliness is a very difficult thing to discuss because people are lonely for different reasons. I suppose the far end of the spectrum would be the incel crisis, which is part of the men's mental health crisis, but like I said, very extreme. And they're misunderstood as well. They're not seen as like in need of mental health support. They're obviously extremely lonely, extremely depressed, extremely anxious, autism highly overrepresented, and they need help. They don't need to be scorned or shouted at or vilified or pushed away even further. The vast majority of incels are not dangerous to anyone other than, like you said yourselves. The incel situation is so serious, but yet so fundamentally misunderstood. That there's sort of no hope of changing it. So I think a better understanding and a greater sense of compassion towards male loneliness, I don't think it quite functions in the statistical way you said, but I just think a great understanding of men and why they need each other is what we need.
A lot of which comes from dialogue, doesn't it? But there are definitely some areas like domestic abuse, homelessness, things like that, where men are not given the representation that the statistics paint a picture of in this discussion. And I know that one of the examples that comes up most often is, I mean, you described it briefly before, is 11% of domestic abuse victims in the UK 11% of domestic abuse victims that a male will attempt or die by suicide. And what is actually the statistics that we have are probably a long way off where they need to be because of the way that male domestic abuse is treated, because it's not taken with the severity that's required. And that means that our understanding of the problem and how many situations like that contribute to some of the data, because if there's 3 million men in that situation around the UK, we're looking at around 94 to 97 men die a week, I believe, in line with current statistics, that die by suicide each week in the UK. And there's numbers floating around there that mean that we can look to certain categories and find more answers and clarity and sort of roadmaps to solutions or help at the very least that don't get any media attention at all, do they?
No. Well, like domestic violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I keep talking about these ogres that are basically stopping discussion around these important issues happening. I know there's no greater ogre than the one guarding the discussion around domestic violence. Like, if you really want to hit the hornet's nest, go try post some content about male victims of abuse, especially abuse by women. And it's seen as a highly controversial topic, and I do not understand why it doesn't need to be. And it's absolutely, like I said, the fact that no one's willing to talk about male victims of abuse, but a lot of people want to talk about male suicide is another show of hypocrisy, because domestic violence is one of the causes of abuse. So if you want to talk about suicide, you have to talk about abuse, because they're the same, they're inextricably linked. But people aren't willing to do it, because talking about male suicide is highly commendable and sort of normal now, status quo. But then talking about male victims of abuse is certainly not. And people aren't willing to make that sacrifice to dive into the mud of talking about male victims of abuse. And even just to see male suicide as a much broader issue than just one fixed thing. But the numbers on domestic abuse are terrifying. It's one of the things I think most people don't understand. It's the most misunderstood issue I think I post about. It's the amount of times I've blown my own mind by reading research on it. I'm just like, it's unbelievable how wrong we are, and the amount of damage that's done to women and men as a result of being that wrong. And I wonder how we'll look back at these times and the amount of failure and death and suffering we caused as a result of how ignorant we are as a society.
And the animosity between people that had the opportunity to be compassionate along the way.
Yeah,
I think that's what gives me the most disdain is the fact that we swing the clubs. I know it's a small minority of ogres that are swinging the clubs, but the clubs are being swung nonetheless. And the people that then go flying through the air as a result of the clubs get pissed off too. And then before we know it, it's a melting pot of conversation that is doing no good and is actually potentially swinging the other way, which is harm for all. It's not helping women. It's not helping men. It's not helping humanity. And it's not actually helping solve either side of the coin.
Well, the ogres holding those clubs, they may be few in number, but the ogres holding it, they're the CEOs of massive multi-million-dollar domestic violence charities that have a huge amount of influence. And it's annoying because domestic violence didn't start off this way. Like I've met the woman that set up the first refuge in the world for women called Erin. So shout out to your wife. And she straight away, the first day she opened up the first refuge, she realized like most of these women are violent themselves. 60 of the first 100 women that came to her were at least as violent, if not more violent, than the husband they were fleeing from. So she was like, it's not gendered, it's cyclical, reciprocal, and generational. It's very complex. And first, I need to set up a refuge for men. And then, like I said, that's when the ogres come. And Erin went from being a national hero, saving thousands of lives of women and girls all over the UK, to being seen as a horrible, misogynistic woman, which she's not. And she was exposed to death threats, harassment, picketing, bomb squad going through her mail, and had a police escort. So that's the sort of thing we're dealing with. The domestic violence industry does not want to talk about male victims of abuse. And there's a horrible history of 50 years of denial and erasing the truth and not helping men. But it didn't start that way. It started with Erin, who was a wonderful woman, extremely compassionate and smart, still alive today. And if only we had stuck with her initial direction of seeing domestic violence as a generational issue, usually from childhood, that is not gendered, perhaps we wouldn't be in this situation. But unfortunately, her own movement was hijacked. She was thrown out of her own charity, which later became Refuge UK. And the rest is history.
That's mind-blowing. I didn't know that. That's
honestly, Erin's story is
very
special.
I'll look that up afterwards. I mean, I say fascinating is the wrong word. It's plain wrong, but it's
well, her approach
it goes to show how far off the mark we are.
She was genius. She was a genius. Her strategy was amazing. Like, because there's no money for domestic violence, there was little now and there's nothing then. She just basically went and squatted in houses. So she would just go into a house, squat, bring in women and girls to squat in a house. They would take over, and she would just go to the next house. And she went house to house to house, took over whole streets of women and girls, took over a whole hotel of about 60 different suites, filled them up with abused women. And I don't know if there's anyone in the world with more experience of working with abused women than Erin Pitsey. And she absolutely does not think it's a gendered issue. And she thinks that gendered issue side of it's called the big lie. That's what she thinks. It's the big lie, and it's not gendered. And I'm like, how could you argue with her? Like, who has more experience than the woman that set up the domestic violence industry itself? So we're in good company, I think. The experts that are on my side of this discussion of non-gendered violence are huge, not just Erin, but there's so many amazing researchers that have substantiated the fact that men are abused in numbers more or less equal to women. And we've ignored them. We just don't care. It doesn't matter how prestigious, it doesn't matter how many papers or studies they provide, it doesn't matter how many refuges they open. We don't want to hear it because it's not popular. But that is changing, but not changing fast enough.
And it goes right back to it, doesn't it? That there are undeniably gender-related issues on either side. But in the middle of that, there are a huge amount of non-gender related issues and challenges that we can collectively help solve together. Yet the need for binary camps means that we lose sight of that and therefore slow down our progress as a collective, which by virtue means that the gender-specific issues don't get the attention that they might warrant. And it's just, I wish we could all do better. So without getting all existential and cosmic like we did earlier, that's where we need to be. Well,
capturing in a soundbite, you'd say just treat the issue, not the gender. And I don't even know when an issue becomes gendered. Like, it doesn't. Take police brutality, for example. 95% of Americans killed by police are men. But I'm not in favor of making that gendered, because I want to help that final 5% as well. I want to help anyone that's a victim of police brutality. I want to help anyone that's a victim of abuse. I don't care if it's just one man and 1 million women. That man deserves to be helped too. So this concept of gendered issues, I don't even know if I can name a single gendered issue in that sense. And it's interesting because we don't gender anything the opposite way. Like 9 out of 10 people that die on the streets homeless in the UK are men. I don't see that discussed as a gendered issue. Suicide isn't a gendered issue, and it shouldn't be seen as a gendered issue. Gender plays a role in it, for sure, because it's not the same experience for women and men, but I don't think the issue itself is gendered. And I don't even know what that even means. At what point, how unbalanced does disparity have to be from men versus women for it to be gendered? Do you think, I'd love to know. Have you got an answer for that?
The only things that jump into my mind are things like period tax related discussions on things like that are quite literally by virtue of birth. Again, murky territory here in terms of how stuff is aligned, but in terms of by biological sex, there are probably some things that would be gender ascribed, in my opinion. Well, not a huge amount that are jumping into my head, but things like that.
Stuff like infant male circumcision is gendered, but then again, you also have FGM, so it's not gendered. But that's what I mean. We get stuck in the weeds because we're just making everything about A team and V team.
And the interesting fact there is that most genital mutilation, male or female, is administered by females, isn't it? Statistically.
Well, FGM is FGM. I'm not an expert on FGM, but I know enough to know that it's usually by elder women tribes, often in African societies. I know there's lots of different types of FGM. Some of them are absolutely barbaric and probably the worst thing you could do to a person. Some of them are not as severe and are actually comparable to male circumcision. But the only reason I ever bring up the fact that women often are doing it to other women or girls is because people rely on this trope of like by other men. Like whenever you talk about male victims of abuse, everyone's always like, violent crime or murder, everyone's like, well, it's by other men. And I'm like, well, things like FGM are by other women, but it doesn't mean we stop caring about them, because obviously it doesn't matter doesn't matter who does it. It doesn't impact the person who's victimized any less.
But the action is the problem, not who is the recipient. I mean, obviously, the recipient is part of the issue, but it's the action that's the issue. In the same way, police brutality is the problem, not the category of person that is receiving it. The problem is the source, and that needs to be addressed. And I think an emerging discrepancy that's very modern and quite ascribed to the space in which I operate in some ways is body dysmorphia. 2021 survey had 54% of men saying that they had a form of body dysmorphia, whilst 49% of women in the same study said that they did. And those stats shocked me because of, I guess, societal understanding of how this narrative normally goes, but I have noticed an increasing confusion with men around how they feel that they should be perceived and look, but it's been, I guess, a more commonly discussed area with women and how the beauty industry presents itself and all these things. So the fact that that is the case, and then we have comments like the ones Billie Eilish made at the end of last year, whenever it was, saying that men aren't subject to this sort of thing. Women, we all get along, so we support one another. Things like that just completely diminished those 54% of men, or those that are higher that aren't actually willing to admit that they've got that challenge, is again, ignorance or statement without knowledge is doing more damage to men than the things that are right in front of us. So it's insights and knowledge acquisition that will help us better understand what it is that we can do as a society to help men. So body dysmorphia as a whole, what is your understanding of the direction that's going with men?
It's a bit like what I talked about in therapy, how often our approaches are developed around how it presents in women. And I think the same with body dysmorphia. Like men are not insecure about the same thing women are insecure about. Like men are insecure about their hairline or their height or their penis size, that sort of thing. Women are more often insecure about their body weight, for example. So I think a lot of women don't understand the fact that it presents differently in men, and therefore we don't really see it in the same way. And that sort of leads us to this insanely ignorant thing for Billie Eilish to say, where she said men aren't insecure about their bodies because women are nice. And I'm like, well, men are insecure about their bodies, and not all women are nice. Like a lot of men's insecurities around their body does actually come from other women, especially around things like height and how short men are shamed, and not just from women either. Like men that are tall get paid more than short men. They get the easier, more promotions, more pay rises and stuff like that. They're just seen as more respectable. It's like the whole president thing, where it's always a taller president that gets elected. So it's not the same, and it's an emerging problem. And thankfully, we're seeing more and more represented in that statistic, to the point where there are now more men with signs of body dysmorphia than women. And it's really sad, because it not only destroys men's mental health and erodes their perspective of what is a perfectly beautiful body and an attractive guy, but they also encourage them to enter into like very dangerous surgical procedures and medical procedures to try and ameliorate the problem. So we have things now like leg breaking surgery. Leg breaking surgery was originally for people that had a leg shorter than the other. It was a very useful medical thing to help people with an actual condition. But now men are doing it for cosmetic reasons, and it costs like $10,000. Like, I think it costs about $50,000. It gives you about 2 inches more. And what they'll do is they'll break both your femurs, and they'll put titanium extending tubes into them. Your face says it all. And they'll extend the tubes over a period of months, excruciatingly painful. Imagine having your bone stretched permanently. And then after 2 or 3 months, they'll take them out. And like, that's what men are doing. That's how far they're going to. That's how insecure a lot of men are. And then there's various different things like penis size, like various contraptions or implants or like pumps or pills. And it's endless. And it's just, none of these are like safe. None of them work. They're dangerous. And they're all as a result of that 51%, I think you said, of men having body dysmorphia issues.
54, I think 54. It was. And it's, again, a number that's increasing, I think. And I think I went on a podcast in California at the start of 2023. And we were just laughing beforehand about what stuff performs best for them, etc. And they said that their best and their most engaged with, the most viewed video ever was about penis pumps. And it was, I kind of laughed at the time, being like, oh, it's an interesting topic. But actually, the deeper question is, well, actually, people are looking for answers. And that comes from that insecurity around, am I adequate, with things that you ultimately can't change without, as you've just described and my face has told the story, are real stretches. I can't see how medically that is sound. I see that as an intervention that probably doesn't have the reinforcement that required to make it something long. Didn't they do a South Park episode on this? I think there was a South Park episode 10 years ago or something where somebody was elongated by breaking bones, and here we are in modern day where that's the thing. And I don't want to dismiss the fact that people are being led to that because of the source issue, but it's my hairline. I've always had the piss taken out of me for mine. I'm just showing the camera here. It's always been high, but it's never actually gone backwards. And there are people that have taken the piss out of it.
It's beautiful.
Whose hairlines have since gone backwards. So I'm going to take this moment to just say I told you so on that one if you're listening. But also it's never bothered me, but I feel that if it did start going backwards, it would bother me. And I'd be pretty sharpish on. I'd probably head to Turkey. I would have it adjusted if it did start going backwards. I feel that there'd be a part of me that I'd lose, and I'd probably do something about it. I'll say that here and now. I've never actually said that on a podcast before in a video, but that is something that I am aware of. And I make a living in fitness, but I'm not in any way body composition driven. I never have been. I did it once and decided this isn't healthy. Everything is performance, utility. How can I measure my ability to do things and improve my things on metrics, not how I look visually, because I find that quite empowering and freeing. But the things about my appearance that I can't change, like if my hairline went backwards, I guess there's a locus of control there that I lose because I don't have power over that. And then I'd be faced with the decision of, do I still feel like myself, or do I? And that's got to come from the judgment that society's given, because I'm quite unfazed by other things. So yeah, it's. I think it's a problem that's only going to get worse because social media is becoming more and more sensationalist, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, Fergus, like, your hair is beautiful and luscious and amazing. So I hope you don't feel insecure about it anymore.
Thank you.
But I think the sad thing about men's insecurities are on their body, and I'm careful not to speak on women's behalf, but things that women are insecure about, like their weight, for example, that can actually be changed through dieting. But if you're a short man, or a short man with like a receding hairline, or a bald man, or have a small penis, there's not, what can you do about that? Like, you can't, there's nothing, if you're short, you're short. Unfortunately, that's nothing you can do about it. But I wonder if women have more ability to change their body to make themselves feel less insecure than men, because things like body fat are more within your control. Not entirely, of course, but they're certainly more within your control than your height. The thing about the penis implants as well, I think it's called a pneuma, and it's basically like a silicone roll that goes around your dick, and it just makes it much bigger. And the scary thing is that the way that passed FDA inspection was because it was the same technology as we use in like Brazilian bum implants and boob jobs. So the way it works in America, as long as you can show, as long as another FDA approved approach has been signed off, you can do it elsewhere. So because you can use in bums and boobs, it can be used in penises as well. But it shouldn't be, because it's not the same. Because unlike your bum, your penis gets bigger and smaller and changes shape and size every single day, all day. And that's why it doesn't work. And that's why there's been so much pain and trauma as a result of these products. Only compounds the mental health side of it, because now it's even worse and you've spent a huge amount of money. And I think it's slowly changed. I think people are actually opening their eyes to men being insecure of their bodies just as much as women. But I wish we would talk more about how they're often insecure about different things, different parts of their body, for example.
Yeah, I don't think that's given enough to. I mean, I've learned a lot just there, even in terms of how that 54% manifests itself with a few things. And I didn't know the lengths that we've been gone to with. I mean, bone breaking surgery has blown my mind a little bit in terms of the fact that is now a real thing, but is a byproduct of a problem that we need to tackle, which is why are we feeling this way? Who are we trying to become person X for? Which I kind of think goes back to what we discussed in some ways before, is if we can become emotionally literate about what we want to achieve, who we want to be, those voices externally will have less power over us, which is a skill that is developed over time.
Yeah, I mean, for things like height and penis size, I think it's quite obvious that a lot of that's coming from men wanting to fulfill a certain type of standard for women. Yeah. Whether that's explicitly said by women or not, that's who men are doing it for. There are obviously other benefactors, like I said, you tend to get paid more. You're treated with more respect in general if you're taller, but it's impossible not to talk about dating standards and how many women have that literally impossible to meet standards. I'm lucky because I'm quite tall, but I know loads of men and I met loads of women that will not date men that are not 6 foot tall, and I'm like, only a tiny percentage of the population is 6 foot tall. Like it's just not possible, and a man's value isn't based on his height in any sort of way. So I think the value system that values men more if they're taller, with a full head of hair and, penis size and stuff, I think a lot of that is coming from women. Not entirely. It comes from men too, but like I said, it comes from society as a whole.
And jokes are made about it. I mean, I have seen there's tweets, there's reels, there's TikToks, there's plenty of things that I've seen that are poking fun at these things that, I'd never done. You had
Angela Rayner.
It's all these things. And
Angela Rayner calling Rishi Sunak a pint-sized loser just last week. I'm like, so that's like one of the most, she seemed to be one of the most powerful politicians in this country. She's calling the Prime Minister a pint-sized loser because he's short, he's a short man. And I'm like, how is that? There's so many things you could criticize Rishi Sunak about. And I was going to say, he's done so much damage, although arguably less so than his sort of former Prime Ministers. He's done so much. Why on earth would you pick his height? Like that's relevant to anything whatsoever. And it's like, you would not get a male politician criticizing a female politician's body in the same way. Like it just wouldn't happen, and it shouldn't happen. And she's not apologized, and I don't think people are not that interested, but it must have impacted him, and also it impacts other men who are short.
It's a personal attack, isn't it? You can attack him for his policies, you can attack him for the mistakes made, of which you've got a long list to choose from. Yeah. But it's a personal attack, which means that it's chosen and delivered with malice, because that's where you maybe hit.
But it's not even just a personal attack, but it's an attack that impacts other men who are totally not involved in that situation, other short men who are also going to be offended, insulted, quite rightly, understandably so. And like, why are they getting caught in the crossfire of Angela's stupid insults? It's a bit like when Greta Thunberg body shamed Andrew Tate for having a small dick. And like, I obviously hated that, and I hate Andrew Tate, but the same thing. There's so much to say about Andrew Tate that is negative. Why are you picking up on penis size? Why are you catching men in a crossfire of your big? What is that? There's nothing to do. I don't care about Andrew Tate, but I do care about men who are going to read that and be like, "You're attaching value to penis size yet again. You're saying I have lesser value because of the size of my dick." And like, it shouldn't matter who's being body shamed, because body shaming doesn't just impact the person it's aimed at, like Rishi or Andrew Tate. It impacts all men that are reading it. And you just would not have a senior politician body shaming, a male senior politician body shaming a woman, like in that sort of way. But it's perfectly fine to do it with Rishi Sunak, apparently.
Yeah, it's big disparity there. If Rishi Sunak had said something that was appearance driven,
Also,
I mean, I feel like they can get away with
Rishi
almost anything
Sunak
now.
I think Rishi Sunak's a Punjabi Indian by his heritage, and he's actually above average for someone of his ethnic background. So also, I don't see what she's saying. How is that not racist? Like, what is sexist and racist? Because she's actually commenting on his ethnicity as well as his sex, and it's just a stupid thing to say that you would not get the other way around. And you just need to grow up, I think, Angela. Like, no, you're supposed to be our role model for like well-meaning grown-up discourse, and you're here talking like a little playground bully. It's like, grow up.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? There's a lot of growing up to be done in lots of different corners of the internet and communities, and the narrative around all these things is exactly that. I think it's compassion and maturity is what needs to develop in people to be able to actually tackle a lot of these problems head on. So I think in the spirit of trying to tackle problems head on, I have two final questions. First of all, how can men be better to support women in the challenges that they face?
How can men better support women?
Yeah.
In the challenge that women face?
Correct.
It's difficult because I feel like that's a question for a woman to answer. I mean, that's a question I want a woman to tell me, because I mean, the way I support women is in the way in which I want women to support men. And that is, we need you. You are our allies, but you are also a guest. You're a guest in this situation. When I go to the Women's March in London, I don't stand at the front and bang a drum. I stand at the back and I make up the numbers and I show my support. So that's how you can be a better ally to women, by showing your support in a way that isn't like, hello, look at me. And in the same way that I'd say that to women too, like, women are very much needed in men's advocacy. Like I said earlier, women are the role models when it comes to building coalitions. They're the innovators of language. They communicate better than men can, whether that's biological or social is besides the point. And they're just better at campaigning. There's so much to learn from women and what they've achieved and the huge amount of success they've had for women's rights. And we need them in the men's movement too, because we need to learn from that. And we also just need numbers. But at the same time, it does frustrate me how many women become centered in these conversations and they fail to recognize that they are still a guest, and you can only ever be a guest. And that's not to say we don't need you, because we do, but you need to spend your time lifting up male voices and listening to men in the same way that I listen to women. And I try not, I wouldn't even look to answer this question for that same reason. But it's not down to me to tell men how to be better allies. I should be asking women that, and I should be learning from women, because I don't know what women want, but I will ask them. And I guess the answer to your question is ask them. Like, ask women how they need to be helped.
Well, I guess that's
ask
it, isn't
men
it?
how they need to be helped. And try not to judge them, and try not to sort of interrupt them, speak over them, or get annoyed when they respond in a way they don't like.
No, that was the essence of the next angle to question was going to be the flip side. How can women better support men? I think
so. Two questions. Oh, now I need another question.
It's as simple as that. It's I do. I've said that. Nah, I'll just own it. I'll just say I had two questions, and you've answered them both. You've answered them both simultaneously. So it all works out in the end. But I guess the fact that the answer is the same is a good thing, because it really feeds back to the fact that this is a non-gender discussion in many ways, and there'll be people that might see the title of this. There'll be people that might see clips from it. There'll be people that will jump to comments that will immediately have an opinion because there's a word that's used, or there's a statement that's said, which is wrong. That's not the way to have discourse, not the way to be a grown-up adult, to form nuanced opinion about things, to take action, to have an impact on what happens next. And that's why I guess my two questions becoming one is probably the best way to summarize that, because how can a human being better support another human being? Listen to them and be there for them is kind of the crux of it in many ways.
Yeah, and also, like, especially when you're talking about sensitive issues, like things like domestic and sexual violence, where obviously women have so many experiences that should never have happened. A lot of women will only listen to that information from other women. Like, it doesn't, like me trying to tell women about domestic violence because I'm a man and a white man at that. A lot of them don't want to hear for what I've got to say, and I do understand that. And that's why I feel a lot of women will give more space and time to other women saying these things, which is frustrating. But that's just how it is at the minute. So I think women helping other women understand is a massive benefit. I remember I sat on a panel once with Susie Bennett talking about mental health and male suicide. And there were just certain things I couldn't say to the audience because I was a man. And despite even a man talking about male suicide, I couldn't say these things because they were unpopular. But Susie, who was sat to my left, could, because she's a woman. And she even made a point. She said, I can talk about this because I can say whatever I want. And she has more cards to play in that sense. And I think it's important that men will listen to men more than women, generally speaking. But women are also women to women more than men, generally speaking. And that we need to make full use of that.
What do you want the Tin Men's impact to be on this space? I know you can't give a pithy answer. You can't say we solve the world, but what is driving you forwards? Is it simply compassion for others? What is it that gets you out of bed in the morning to tackle this fight?
I mean, every week I look at my phone and it says I've reached 100,000 people around the world with information. So knowing that I can reach that many people, just change their mind in a little way or make them aware of something a little better or inform them in a way that they weren't informed previously, is a reward that is almost beyond description. It's such a privilege and an amazing thing to be able to do, to have that bestowed upon me. I did a post today just about Iran and how many executions are happening in Iran. And I've had loads of messages from Iranian people being like, thank you, no one's talking about this anymore. We really appreciate it. Like, thank you for, in your small way, reminding the world of what's going on. And like little DMs like that, little messages of thanks, reminders to me that I am making people visible that are not particularly visible in an area of discourse that is highly unpopular, meaning men and boys advocacy, is, I know it's not going to pay my mortgage, but it's still one of the best things about my life. So I treasure it. So I want to keep doing that. I've got no financial sort of end goal here. I'm not trying to launch, an acting career or a book. I'm not trying to sell merchandise. I just want to make people aware of what's going on in the best way I possibly can. And I certainly don't get that right every single day, but I will keep going nonetheless, just trying to raise awareness. And I don't have all the solutions, but I do think the first step to finding the solutions is talking about them. So I'll do that, and I'll hopefully more collaborations and people such as yourself will come through that. And I know, I really enjoy it. I enjoy it personally, and I enjoy it creatively, and I enjoy the sense of helping people. I'm like chronically self-righteous person to an annoying degree. So when I get these messages, it does really help. And I don't know, I've got a bit of a special ability where I don't really care too much about what people think of me. As long as I'm happy with who I am and I know what I'm saying is well intended and accurate, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. As long as I get to go to bed knowing that's who I am, it doesn't matter what the whole world could hate me. So it feels like I am kind of suited to this area of advocacy because there were not very many plaudits or brand deals to be won or awards. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And I'll keep going anyway. So maybe a sense of obligation as well is what's keeping me going. But to answer your question, just awareness raising. Currently through Instagram and social media, maybe one day through film, I don't know. But awareness raising is what I want.
A seed was planted there, I believe.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the end of the day, my hope is that through conversations like this one, through advocacy, that somebody might hear something that feels like it speaks to them, and that might elicit a positive change in their life. And that is a phenomenal thing to be able to elicit through having two white males talking on a podcast. Shocking.
I know. Well, I mean, I obviously get a lot of shit from people, like every so often, and that's okay because every now and again I get a message from a man who keeps going as a result of something I've put up or something I've said, or I make someone feel seen. And it doesn't matter to me if 100 people hate me. As long as that one person can have their life change for the better, that's good enough. And it's like I said, I'm so lucky and privileged to be in a position to have such an opportunity to impact so many people. And what more could anyone possibly want?
The golden question. That's exactly it. I think there's been loads of valuable things in there for me personally. So selfishly, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, but I'm confident that everybody listening will have taken things away. And again, thought provocation is all I want these discussions to be about. That's all I think that dialogue on difficult conversations should be. And I think hopefully we've provoked some thought. Well,
I've given you one new word for the day, which was alexithymia, and I'll give you another one, which is parrhesia, which is Greek, and it stands for to speak openly and apologize for so speaking. And it basically
How are we spelling that?
Parhesia, I think. But what
I
it
realized,
means,
as I said, how are you spelling that was potentially the biggest undermine of your intellect, saying, here's another Greek word for you. Oh, no.
the spelling is not what's important. The definition is what's important. And the definition is, it's basically free speech. But born in free speech, it recognizes the ability to apologize if you're wrong. So it basically means say what you think is right, and if you're wrong, apologize. And that's like what this podcast hopefully should be about. It's like say what you think, and don't treat people in a way that they can't express themselves because they're scared. But then also be like, understand that if you're wrong, you have to acknowledge it, you're wrong. And so to speak openly and apologize for so speaking. Parhesia.
There we are. And somehow we managed to tie it back to ancient Greeks, having mentioned them a few times. So there's a nice...
Thank you.
They were wise. They were wise.
Well, yeah,
but
they knew their stuff.
They did. And they're revered, and there's lots of Stoic quotes floating about the internet. So if we're going to take one side of the coin, we should also take the other. And there we have alexithymia and Parhesia. Parthesia?
Yeah, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Oh, damn it. I didn't nail the delivery of it.
Good enough.
That'll do. Well, George, thank you very, very much. Really enjoyed that. And at the Tin Men is where people can find you. It's an easy one to find. If you put the Tin Men, if you just search Tin Men, you'll find some people that are not George.
Yeah, don't want that.
I learned that. No, definitely not. So there's loads of phenomenal insights into lots of things that you probably won't have thought with as much depth as George has done. So go and check that out. And thank you again. Really enjoyed that, and loads of insights to take away.
Thanks for having me. And I hopefully look forward to meeting your followers on the page and coming back on your podcast again.